Regarding the missing persons case of Nancy Guthrie, that search is entering week 3.
At 1:47 a.m. in the morning, a masked man appears on Nancy Guthrie's doorbell camera. He doesn't hide his face from the lens. He leans toward it, stares directly into it, and then the camera goes black. 41 minutes later, Nancy's pacemaker disconnects from her phone. By sunrise, the 84-year-old grandmother has vanished from her own home. No forced entry, no witnesses, and a ransom demand that investigators say doesn't behave like a real kidnapping. So what actually happened inside that house during those 41 minutes of darkness? Tonight, we follow the digital trail, the strange evidence left behind, and the mystery that still surrounds the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. The evening Nancy disappeared initially seemed completely ordinary. At 9:48 p.m., Tommaso Cioni drove his 84-year-old mother-in-law home to her residence in Pima County, Arizona. That detail isn't speculation. It comes directly from the official timeline released by the Pima County Sheriff's Department. 2 minutes later, at 9:50 p.m., the garage door closed. With that simple action, Tommaso became the last verified person known to have seen Nancy Guthrie alive. In missing person investigations across the United States, detectives follow a predictable starting point. They begin with proximity. Who was there last? Who had access? Who had the opportunity? This doesn't automatically imply guilt. It's simply the way investigations begin. But what happened next quickly moved beyond routine procedure. Within days of Nancy's disappearance, deputies executed a full search warrant at Tommaso Cioni's residence. Not a quick conversation, not a voluntary interview, a formal warrant. Witnesses reported seeing officers enter wearing blue medical gloves. Investigators spent hours inside the property carefully documenting the scene. Several items were removed in sealed evidence bags. Among them, observers noticed something particularly significant: a silver forensic case, often used to transport digital devices like laptops and cell phones for analysis. If this search was simply a basic elimination step, the scale raised questions. Digital evidence isn't seized without reason, and the story only became more complicated when another name quietly began surfacing during the investigation: Dominic Evans. At that point, Evans was not publicly accused of anything. No charges had been filed. But investigators don't only look at physical proximity, they also examine digital and relational connections, communication patterns, shared contacts, overlapping timelines. When Nancy Guthrie's doorbell camera went dark in the early hours of the morning, the investigation began shifting from a simple question of who last saw her to a much more complex one: who stood to benefit from what happened next? At precisely 1:47 a.m., the doorbell camera outside Nancy Guthrie's home suddenly goes dark. The footage shows a masked individual physically reaching toward the device and disabling it. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a power failure. It was deliberate. From that moment forward, the outside world loses its view of what happens at the front of the house. If this were a professional kidnapping, that moment should have marked the beginning of a rapid extraction. Criminals who abduct victims for ransom don't linger. Every extra minute increases the risk of being caught. Neighbors could wake up. Motion sensors might activate. A patrol car could drive past. Speed is everything. But the digital evidence tells a very different story. Inside the house, Nancy Guthrie wore a pacemaker connected wirelessly to her phone through Bluetooth. As long as she remained within range of that device, the connection stayed active. According to forensic analysis, that connection didn't break until 2:28 a.m. 41 minutes after the camera went dark. That means someone was inside the house for 41 full minutes after disabling the camera. 41 minutes is not a quick snatch and grab. It's not panic. It's time. Time to search. Time to move things. Time to argue. Time to stage something. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. Reports indicated she had mobility limitations and relied on medication to regulate her heart condition. Physically overpowering her would not have taken long. If someone intended to abduct her, it could have happened in minutes. So what filled the remaining time? This is where the timeline begins to fracture. During those 41 minutes, neighbors reported no screams. No alarms were triggered. No emergency calls were made. The only silence recorded that night was digital silence. And sometimes silence is intentional. Investigators began reconstructing interior movement patterns using device activity, signal strength changes, and time-stamped digital data. When those patterns were layered over the known timeline, including the fact that Tommaso Cioni was the final confirmed contact and that digital evidence had already been collected from his residence, the 41-minute gap began to carry even more weight. At the same time, the name Dominic Evans continued appearing within investigative discussions, not publicly accused, not charged, but connected through communication networks and relational proximity. And when investigators study major criminal cases, there is often a moment where the focus shifts. The question stops being who entered the house. Instead, it becomes who needed time inside the house. Because 41 minutes is enough time to improvise a story. 41 minutes is enough time to create a scene. And 41 minutes is more than enough time to realize that something has gone terribly wrong. Before the camera went dark, it captured something else, something investigators found deeply unsettling. Not just a masked intruder, a performance. The person seen on Nancy Guthrie's doorbell camera was heavily layered in clothing. Reports described 2 masks worn one over the other, 2 pairs of gloves, bulky garments that actually restricted movement rather than enhancing it. That detail matters. Criminals who operate with precision rely on dexterity. They need flexibility in their hands. They need mobility. Double gloves reduce sensitivity. Heavy clothing slows reaction time. Everything about the outfit suggested someone more concerned about leaving no trace than about moving efficiently. Then there was the handgun. It appeared awkwardly positioned at the front of the waistband, not secured in a holster, and not properly concealed. In professional tactical situations, weapons are secured carefully for stability and quick access. What appeared in this footage looked almost theatrical. It was highly visible, attention-grabbing, intimidating, almost as if the weapon itself was part of the message. Instead of quickly approaching the door and avoiding the camera's angle, the masked figure lingered under the porch light. He bent toward the landscaping. He moved slowly. At one point, he appeared to pull at plants and shrubs. Why create noise? Why stay in full view of the camera? And then came the most striking moment. He looked directly into the lens, not accidentally, deliberately. In countless burglary and abduction cases, suspects try to avoid cameras. They lower their heads. They move through blind spots. They hide their faces. This individual did the opposite. He ensured the camera saw him. That single decision transforms the footage from accidental evidence into something potentially staged. Because if someone wanted the world to believe a violent kidnapping had taken place, what better way to do it than by creating a terrifying image? A masked figure, a weapon, a sudden blackout. It's dramatic, it's frightening, and it's unforgettable, but it's not efficient. When investigators reviewed the footage frame by frame, behavioral analysts reportedly focused less on identifying the person behind the mask and more on the intent behind the movements. The behavior didn't resemble stealth, it resembled signaling, and when you combine that with the 41-minute gap inside the house, the narrative begins to change. If the objective was ransom, speed would matter. If the objective was secrecy, subtlety would dominate. But what appeared here looked more like dramatization, which raises an uncomfortable question. Was the camera an obstacle, or was it part of the script? If the masked figure on the porch created fear, the ransom demand that followed was supposed to create urgency. Within days of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, messages began circulating that demanded millions of dollars in Bitcoin for her safe return. At first glance, this seemed to confirm the kidnapping narrative. A vulnerable victim, a masked intruder, a massive ransom demand. But experienced investigators don't just examine what criminals demand. They study how those demands are delivered. And in nearly every confirmed ransom kidnapping case in the United States, the communication pattern is very specific. Kidnappers contact the family privately. They demand silence. They avoid publicity. The goal is simple: collect the money without attracting attention from law enforcement. But that's not what happened here. Instead of contacting the family quietly, messages reportedly appeared through channels that reached the media. Local outlets, national platforms. Public visibility was not avoided, it was amplified, and that decision immediately changes the risk calculation. The moment the media becomes involved, federal authorities step in. Digital analysts begin tracing cryptocurrency wallets. Cybercrime units start monitoring transactions. Every move becomes visible, Anyone genuinely trying to collect a ransom would normally avoid that level of scrutiny. Then, investigators noticed something even more troubling. There was no confirmed proof of life. No photograph holding a current newspaper. No recorded voice message answering specific questions. No video establishing that Nancy was alive after the night she disappeared. In ransom cases, proof of life is critical. Without it, payment makes little sense. But perhaps the most alarming detail was discovered inside Nancy's home. Her heart medication, left behind. Nancy relied on daily medication to manage her cardiac condition. She wore a pacemaker for a reason. Removing her from the house without those prescriptions drastically reduced the amount of time she could safely survive. For someone demanding millions of dollars, that decision makes no sense. A kidnapper who intends to exchange a hostage for money protects the hostage. They bring necessary medication. They keep the victim alive. Leaving the medication behind suggests something very different. Either ignorance or indifference. And indifference doesn't fit the logic of ransom. When investigators began stacking these details together, the theatrical camera footage, the public ransom demand, and the abandoned medication, the structure of the kidnapping theory started to crack. And once again, attention quietly shifted back toward proximity. Tommaso Sione's home had already been searched. Digital devices had been seized for analysis. Meanwhile, Dominic Evans's name continued appearing within the broader web of relational connections investigators were mapping. No accusations, no charges, but proximity creates patterns, and patterns create questions. Because if the ransom demand wasn't really about money, then what was it about? Some investigators began considering another possibility: distraction. A public ransom spectacle keeps attention focused outward toward masked strangers, cryptocurrency wallets, and shadowy criminals. Meanwhile, investigators have less time to examine the relationships closest to the victim. If that was the intention, the strategy would be simple. Create a loud narrative, let it dominate the headlines, and buy time, because in this case, time may have been the most valuable currency of all. Early in the investigation, authorities confirmed something that shifted the emotional weight of the entire case. Blood had been found near the entryway of Nancy Guthrie's home. Not a large pool, not a dramatic crime scene, but enough to confirm that something physical happened at that doorway. Now consider that detail carefully. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. Reports indicated she had mobility issues. She depended on medication to manage her heart condition. Physically overpowering her would not require prolonged force. If someone intended to abduct her for ransom, injuring her would be unnecessary and dangerous. Violence increases risk. Blood creates evidence. So why was it there? Even more telling is where it appeared. Near the doorway, not deep inside the house. Not in a bedroom, not in a hallway. Right at the threshold. That suggests something happened almost immediately. Several possibilities exist. Nancy may have confronted the intruder. She may have attempted to resist, or she may have fallen. But there is another possibility investigators quietly consider in cases like this. Something went wrong. If the intruder caused a serious injury in those first moments, the situation could have changed instantly. A planned burglary or intimidation attempt might have suddenly escalated into something irreversible. And that possibility brings us back to the 41-minute gap. Not waiting, not negotiating, problem solving, cleaning, staging. Because once blood enters the picture, the stakes change dramatically. When investigators study staged crime scenes, they often see the same pattern. When a crime spirals unexpectedly, the perpetrator attempts to build a louder narrative around it. Something dramatic, something shocking, something that distracts from the original mistake. In this case, the loud narrative was a multi-million-dollar kidnapping, but the quiet evidence was blood at the door. Meanwhile, investigators continued examining the digital landscape surrounding the case. Because in modern investigations, people can lie. Devices cannot. Every phone call, every message, every Bluetooth connection, every app opening, every deleted file, digital activity creates a silent timeline. Nancy's pacemaker provided one piece of that timeline. It remained connected to her phone until 2:28 41 minutes after the doorbell camera went dark. But digital forensics goes deeper than simple timestamps. Investigators analyze signal strength, movement patterns, background processes, battery fluctuations. These tiny details allow analysts to estimate movement inside a house. When devices were removed from Tommaso Sione's residence in secure digital evidence containers, it indicated investigators believed electronic data might be crucial. Messages, call logs, location history, deleted conversations, communication patterns before and after the disappearance. And again, Dominic Evans' name surfaced during relational mapping. Not accused, not charged, but part of the broader communication network investigators were examining. In major cases, digital proximity can become more revealing than physical proximity. Who spoke to whom? Who suddenly stopped communicating? Who deleted messages? Who changed their behavior after the event? Because 41 minutes inside a house doesn't just create time for physical movement. It creates time for coordination. If something unexpected happened that night, digital communication may have played a role. And the uncomfortable truth about digital evidence is this: even when messages are deleted, traces remain. Metadata survives. Cloud backups exist. Network logs record connections. Investigators don't just analyze what was said. They analyze silence. Sudden silence between people who normally communicate can be just as revealing as the messages themselves. Now add another layer. If ransom emails were sent publicly to media outlets, they had to originate from somewhere. A device, an account, a network. Even encrypted systems leave behind traces unless executed with extreme sophistication. So investigators began asking a critical question. If the goal was money, why risk exposure through public channels? But if the goal was distraction, then public communication suddenly makes sense, because it pulls attention away from where investigators often begin looking first: the people closest to the victim. As the investigation continued, one of the earliest focal points began to shift. After executing the search warrant and examining the evidence collected from Tommaso Sione's home, authorities later confirmed that he was no longer considered a suspect in Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. For investigators, that development closed one door, but it didn't close the case. Because eliminating someone from suspicion does not erase the unanswered questions surrounding the timeline. It simply redirects the search. And in a case where an elderly woman vanished from her own home, every remaining detail becomes even more important. Investigators continued reconstructing the final hours before Nancy disappeared, examining every possible pathway that could explain what happened during those 41 minutes of darkness. Could an unknown intruder really have entered the house, subdued Nancy, searched the property, staged a ransom narrative, and disappeared into the night without leaving behind clearer evidence? It's possible, but it's also incredibly rare. Kidnappings involving elderly victims almost never follow the pattern seen here. Most criminals targeting older individuals are looking for quick opportunities: burglaries, theft, financial fraud. Abductions involving elaborate planning, masked disguises, and cryptocurrency demands typically involve younger victims whose families can respond quickly to ransom negotiations. The logistics alone make targeting an 84-year-old woman a strange choice. But there was another factor investigators could not ignore: public attention. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance was not just a local story. It carried national weight, because Nancy wasn't an unknown retiree living quietly in the desert. She was the mother of Savannah Guthrie, one of the most recognizable journalists in America and a longtime host on Today. That connection ensured the case would explode across national headlines almost immediately. News coverage spread rapidly: cable networks, online media, social platforms. Within hours, millions of people were learning Nancy's name. That kind of attention changes the psychological landscape of a crime. For some criminals, attention is the last thing they want. For others, attention is the entire goal. Behavioral analysts sometimes encounter offenders who crave recognition more than money. They want to control a narrative. They want to feel powerful. They want to watch the world react. If someone were motivated by that kind of psychological need, targeting the mother of a national television figure would guarantee exactly the kind of spotlight they were seeking. And that possibility reintroduces an unsettling interpretation of the events captured on the doorbell camera. The masked intruder didn't hide from the lens. He looked directly at it. He lingered under the porch light. He created an image that would be dramatic and frightening if it ever became public. Because a masked figure on camera is unforgettable. It spreads quickly. And once the public sees that image, it becomes the dominant narrative. But investigators are trained to separate images from evidence. The image suggests a kidnapping. the evidence leaves room for other possibilities. Blood near the doorway, medication left behind, a 41-minute gap between the moment the camera went dark and the moment Nancy's pacemaker disconnected from her phone, and a ransom demand that appeared in public channels rather than through the quiet private negotiations typical of real kidnappers. Individually, each detail might be explained. Together, they create a puzzle that still hasn't been solved. Because the truth about crimes like this often hides in the smallest moments, not the dramatic ones that capture headlines, the quiet ones that occur when no one is watching. The 41 minutes inside Nancy Guthrie's home may hold the answer to everything. Those minutes are where the timeline stops being clear. They're where the known facts dissolve into unanswered questions. What happened inside the house after the camera went dark? Why did Nancy's pacemaker remain connected for so long? Was someone searching for something? Was someone trying to decide what to do next? Or was someone creating a scene meant to convince the world that a kidnapping had taken place? Investigators may eventually uncover those answers through digital forensics, witness testimony, or new evidence that hasn't yet surfaced publicly. But until that happens, the case remains suspended in uncertainty. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. Somewhere out there, the truth exists. It exists in a piece of evidence that hasn't been discovered yet, in a witness who hasn't realized what they saw that night, or in digital data quietly waiting to be uncovered. And sometimes the smallest detail, a phone signal, a camera frame, a forgotten message becomes the key that breaks a case wide open. Until that moment comes, one question continues to echo through the investigation. Not just who took Nancy Guthrie, but what truly happened during those 41 minutes when the camera went dark. Because in investigations like this, darkness doesn't hide the truth forever. Eventually, something always comes into the light.